It was clear already before the NATO summit in Vilnius that the door was not open to Ukraine to join the alliance anytime soon. But at least it's clearer now what Ukraine can expect as the U.S. and its allies unveiled new security assurances designed to bolster Ukraine against Russia.
Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. Last week's NATO summit in Vilnius achieved its primary goals, which were to 1. Reach an agreement that Sweden can join the alliance, and 2. Strengthen support for Ukraine. However, Ukrainian President Zelensky expressed frustration that there was no clear path to membership. Joe Biden, in an interview with CNN on the eve of the summit, even said that Ukraine cannot join NATO while the country was at war. And Ben Wallace, the UK Defense Secretary, said that, quote, whether we like it or not, people want to see a bit of gratitude, end quote, when asked about Zelensky's frustration. All of this creates the impression that NATO is not entirely united. In this episode, we'll examine some of these points and discuss how expansion has impacted NATO. My guest today is Professor Jussi Hanhimäki. Professor Hanhimäki is Professor of International History and Politics and Chair of the Department of International History and Politics here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He was also our guest the last time we spoke about NATO in May of last year in episode 18 of this series. And just a friendly reminder that you can find that episode and all of our episodes on platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, among others. Can you remind us of the key moments in NATO's history and the reasons for all of these successive expansions or enlargements?
Right. So you go all the way back to the beginning. So we're looking at April 1949 when NATO was founded treaty signed in Washington, D.C. April 4th, 1949. So we're looking at almost 75 years now. Right. It was originally United States, Canada, and a select number of West European countries, right. And was founded basically at the beginning of the Cold War to effectively contain the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. And so that was number one. Over time, in the last 75 years or so now, NATO's gone through a number of crises and a number of enlargements. There's been crises between the alliance members about questions that beyond the NATO area, so outside of Western Europe, questions, crises between NATO members, key members like United States, France, and Britain over the Suez Canal crisis in 1956. Questions about Europeans and their lack of support for the United States in Vietnam, a decade later. Crises in the early 2000s regarding the US-led intervention in Iraq. And so on and so forth. There's a lot of crises of that sort of what we call the out-of-area issues. At the same time, in the same period, NATO has been a very successful organization. It's never lost a member. It's increased its membership. It's almost triple now than what it was at the beginning. So we're today at 32 member states, with Sweden being the last one to effectively join NATO last week when Turkey and Hungary dropped their opposition to that membership. So there's something about NATO that's very attractive, obviously, to countries that join. And I think that's the sense of a common security, of a guarantee against external threats. That's underlined in our so-called Article 5, which basically says one for all and all for one. So that's its sort of leitmotif, its rationale for being there in the first place, and it's served the alliance well. And as long as there are perceived threats outside, I think NATO is very likely to stay there and retain, perhaps continue to enlarge going forward.
Right, and we'll talk about some of the elements you mentioned in some of the questions that are coming up. But the next question I have is, NATO never seemed more important than it did on February 24th last year when Russia invaded Ukraine. But just before that, it was criticized by Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron as not being maybe the most useful organization. What was the evolution of the U.S. role in NATO before the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, so the US is, it's always been the key country in NATO in a sense that it's provided what we sort of fashionably call the nuclear umbrella for all alliance members. And it's provided the guarantee. There's always been American troops stationed in Europe since World War II. And that's provided a certain guarantee for countries that maybe feel exposed to threats from A, the Soviet Union, and B, later on, other threats. Obviously, since February 24th, Russia has re-emerged as the big concern, if not already before, in fact, in 2014, to some extent. So the US has been there as the guarantor, and it's something that there's a sort of a love-hate relationship between Western Europe and the United States, because on the one hand, there is a dependency, it seems, that on the part of Europe on American security guarantees. At the same time, there is some of the crises I mentioned earlier, like Vietnam, Iraq, and so forth, that then imply some kind of complicity on the part of NATO in whatever less than savory policies the United States, less than popular policies the United States is engaged in the rest of the world. And I think that's often been the case. Now, in terms of Trump, of course, his big complaint was about NATO, basically Europe being a free rider on American security guarantee. I mean, that's not a new complaint for Trump. It's something that's been there since the 1960s, certainly, and come up now and every now and then. It's something that in recent decades, it's been about how much each country spends on defense has been a big issue. There's this magic threshold of 2% of GDP.
Yeah. Which many countries aren't meeting.
No, most countries do not reach there. The United States way above that, but in Europe, very few countries hit the mark. I think one of the new entrants, Finland, is one of the few countries that actually does, but that's perhaps explained by the geographic location,
exactly,
as well as anything else. Yeah. And so that's one complaint on the part of the Americans, and on the part of the Europeans, and particularly in the case of Macron, it's about wondering what NATO is for or stands for in a world in which threats, the Cold War no longer exists. So you don't have that kind of big external threat. And there's been a lot of sort of soul searching in terms of should NATO go outside of the NATO area in one way or another.
Yeah, I even read maybe even as far as Asia.
As far as Asia. And in fact, there's been a limited sort of NATO engagement in Afghanistan since 2001, a little bit in Iraq, also in terms of training at that point after the initial crisis disappeared. There was, of course, the Libyan case during the Obama administration, in which NATO was quite active, and technically that was outside the NATO area. So there's been a sort of transformation in that sense, that the out-of-area question or engagement is no longer entirely off the books. Right. But it still raises now the big topic today is not to actually Russia or Ukraine, it's China. Right. And whether China is the next Cold War adversary for the NATO alliance. And of course, that is likely to divide opinion among the 32 countries that are in NATO, and particularly across the sort of transatlantic divide. There's likely to be a very different perception about how that all works out.
Yeah. And so we just talked about the role of the US, and what could you say about the evolution of the role of the UK, France, and Germany in this alliance?
So the UK is traditionally the strongest ally of the United States. It often sees more or less eye to eye with the United States. It's historically, in fact, we're going to even make the case that NATO was not really an American initiative, but it was a European and particularly UK initiative. And to bring the United States into the alliance was important for the UK, because otherwise, at the moment in the late 40s, the UK was really the only serious military player in Europe. So the UK has always played a role. It has been the least critical in many ways of America's engagements outside the NATO area, like Iraq. Of course, the UK joined in that in 2003. So there is a bit of as a consequence, there's a little bit of a sort of continental Europe versus the UK division that's there. But the UK is one of the countries that indeed does go above that 2% threshold, and thus, of course, has its own nuclear weapons. It's a strong player it's probably the strongest military player within NATO aside from the United States. So its role and most active and so. So the UK has been a sort of strong holding a strong alliance to transatlantic link together. Problems lately, Brexit, all of that creates issues, and the UK's role is a bit in question. France and Germany, was very different. Germany in the beginning, it had lost the war. It was not an original member state of NATO, but joined in the 1950s. It was only West Germany. Then after unification, all of Germany. And Germany has been very reluctant traditionally in any kind of military engagement. I think there is the burden of history, World War II, World War I, all of that weighs very heavily on what a German military presence is not viewed in the same way as many other countries' military presence. I think that's been changing in the 21st century, and it's certainly from within Germany changed after February 24th quite significantly. Last year after the Russian invasion, and that Germany was traditionally a sort of practiced this so-called Ostpolitik, which meant it had a fairly close relationship initially with the Soviet Union. That détente, all of that in the 70s was very much part of the West German effort. And then after the Cold War, Germany has been in the forefront of creating all these economic links, the energy supplies from Russia, all of that. The pipelines that were built, these were heavily sort of promoted by Germany as ways of not only getting energy, but also as building some kind of a better political relationship with Russia, which then, of course, all of that sort of went out the window in February 2022. Right. And as a consequence, now we've seen this Germany starting to spend much more on its military, providing military assistance to Ukraine, becoming always been a strong presence in NATO, but now becoming even a stronger military presence as a NATO partner. So I think that's something that's changing. France, the third one you mentioned, is often been the spoiler, often been the problem child within NATO. In fact, if you go back to the 60s, we have NATO Charles de Gaulle, who famously withdrew France from NATO's integrated military structure. So up to 66, NATO headquarters were in Paris. They moved very quickly to Brussels. And for several decades, France was outside it never left NATO. So that would be, that's important to remember. But it was a sort of less of a member of NATO for several decades until the 2000s, until 2008, when France rejoined NATO's integrated military structure. It's very interesting. It is in the context of the Iraq War, in fact, which France was very, very critical of. But as a consequence, France sort of rejoined NATO fully at that moment. But it is still, I think the French policy has traditionally been a sort of more European NATO. And so there is this reluctance to accept American leadership totally. It is to go back to, when crisis comes, yes, then. But in normal, semi-normal times, and I think that's where comments like Emmanuel Macron talked about NATO being brain dead, what he basically said that it doesn't really have a clear purpose. And where does that clear purpose come? It comes from a European focus. Right. It has to be a European alliance, but it should not go out and play about China and so much and all of that. But it is about Europe. And within Europe, which country is the leading continental European military power? France. So in a sense, we have all these power games that are being played, but and each of the country has its own sort of trajectory based on history. And then when you add to that, so we talked about 4 countries, there's 28 other countries, each of them also. And I think that in part explains why NATO has always been it is a strong alliance, but it's always in crisis of some sort internally. Because you have 32 democracies now. Yeah. Democracies are famously very disruptive, and they're supposed to be debating internally everything. Put those together, of course, there's going to be crises and disagreements, because it's hard to imagine that Portugal and Finland would have the exact same perception about national security.
Right. No, it only makes sense. Yeah. So on that, and so last week there was the summit in Vilnius. One of the goals of that summit was, Sweden, making sure Sweden can join. And, Turkish President Erdogan kind of basically, who was blocking this for a long time, last week gave his okay to move forward with Sweden joining. So why do you think he made such a U-turn?
So I think in the case, this was sort of expected that this was likely to happen at some point or another. I think the predominant view would be that what Erdogan has been playing for since last spring, basically, when the Sweden initially applied to join, together with Finland. And then the Finnish application went through with flying colors, and then Sweden was a problem. And technically the issue was about Kurdish resistance and that Turkey considers terrorists, and Sweden has provided some asylum too. And so this was so it's about terrorism. So that was one thing. Now, is that the real reason why Erdogan and Turkey was so reluctant? Is, of course, up for debate. More likely it is, equally likely it is that this was they had a card to play. There was something that they could get out of playing a long game in terms of admitting Sweden and its fighter jets from the United States, for example. And it's perhaps domestic politics as well in Turkey. We just had a presidential election, which Erdogan very narrowly won last month. And so all of this appearing as a strong independent leader who is not swayed by America and so forth. So all of that probably explains part of it. And he went, I think, one step too far in just before the summit, because then he said that, okay, maybe we'll accept. Effectively what he said was, maybe we accept Sweden to NATO, but we want the European Union to consider our application seriously. And before that happens, we can't. We're not going to. He backed off from that the next day, basically, because, and why, perhaps there was American pressure, perhaps the two, it was made clear these two don't link together, etc., etc. But yeah, I think he was really trying to so-called milk the whole thing as much as possible.
Yeah. And so one of the other goals of the summit was providing more support to Ukraine. President Zelensky expressed frustration. He tweeted about it. There was no clear path to joining. Opinions seem to differ even amongst the NATO participants as to whether they should even join. When do you think Ukraine could potentially join, and what would the consequences be?
So I would be very surprised to see Ukraine become a member of NATO while there's still a war going on with Russia, simply because Article 5, which we mentioned in the beginning, one for all for one, it would basically mean that NATO would be at war with Russia from that moment on. And I think that's very difficult to see how that sort of idea would go over in most capitals of NATO countries, or ever get to the point that every legislative in those 32 countries actually ratify something like that. So that's very difficult to see happening. So I still think that there's a very strong likelihood that eventually Ukraine will join NATO, but we are looking more of a long game in terms of a horizon. We don't know how long this conflict is going to go on. The signs are now it's not going to stop anytime this year, and whenever it will stop, will be there will be a whole new political setting. It's very possible when it stops, there will be a new president in the United States. Could be the same as the previous president. You may not know at this moment. It could be that also the war ends in a way that doesn't really, there's no peace agreement as such, but rather a stalemate. And that alone will then prevent, I think, many of the member states from being wholeheartedly in favor of Ukraine's membership. So I think for now one could say that Ukraine is a sort of a member of the extended family of NATO, clearly, but whether it will eventually and when actually join NATO as a full member, then that's something that I wouldn't think will happen in the next for another 5 years or so, right? Okay. At the minimum. That's my guess. But I could be, of course, one can be wrong. Something could happen. Russia could have a change of government, capitulate, etc., and so forth. So yeah.
Okay. And for my final question, is all of this enlargement a strength or weakness for NATO?
Well, the easy answer is yes. So it is a bit of both. The strong thing that for NATO with enlargement, clearly it has breathed new life to this organization that many had, as we pointed out earlier, called brain dead or obsolete or all of those things. So clearly what has happened since 2022 is that its sort of purpose has been reaffirmed. There is still that this is not just the world, that the world still has these old-fashioned security issues like war and peace that kind of matter an awful lot in different parts. And then therefore old-fashioned things like military alliances can be very, very important for in that particular context. And I think that's what happened with the war, with the enlargement to Finland and Sweden. That's also made it clear that NATO as such it remains the sort of history's most successful military alliance. I think that's right. What's often been called. And I think there's no doubt that as of this moment, that's probably the case. It's in part because NATO hasn't really gone to war. And that's the paradox of NATO. It's there to exist to prevent war, and it's been fairly successful. It's been very successful in terms of the member states. Not so for countries that are almost member states like Ukraine. And so, of course, that's something else. So in that sense, what we've seen is a reaffirmation of the history of NATO as being successful, its role that it can play in protecting against external threats. And as a consequence, I think its sort of popularity among voters and among publics within NATO countries has clearly gone up. Now, the negative thing, of course, with NATO enlargement is that it does bring, every time you add a Finland, a Sweden, potentially Ukraine, you add a whole new set of issues and challenges to NATO, both internally, but most importantly, you now have another 1,000 kilometers plus border with Russia when Finland joined. Now, that is a potential sort of trigger point for conflict, at least in today's international climate. So consider Ukraine joining. We've seen that border with Russia is actually, and with Belarus is actually quite ripe for conflict already. So that is certainly, it creates a whole new set of challenges in terms of NATO, looking at NATO's strategy forward.
Right.
What does it mean? Do we need to build a big wall on the Finnish border? They're actually doing a little bit of that already. The Finns are, because they've got a bit paranoid over in my home country for understandable reasons. But so there's a bit of that's happening. And I think in terms of, like I said before, if you have a Finland, you have a Canada, you have a Portugal and a Turkey, do they have the same concerns about security? They won't. And that's going to, in democracies, those different concerns are always going to be voiced in election time and so forth. And so there's going to be a lot of debate, I think, increasing debate about why are we in NATO, especially in crisis moments like this.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Jussi, for joining us once again to talk on this topic in this series. Yeah. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, Dan. Thanks a lot.
That was Professor Jussi Hanhimäki discussing NATO in light of last week's summit in Vilnius. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.